Without him I could do nothing. Without him I'd surely fail. Without him I would be drifting like a ship without a sail. Without him I would be dying. Without him I'd be enslaved. Without him life would be hopeless. But with Jesus, thank God, I'm saved. Jesus, oh Jesus, do you know him today? You can't turn him away, oh Jesus, oh Jesus. Without him, how lost I would be. Jesus, oh Jesus, do you know him today? Please don't turn him away, oh Jesus, oh Jesus. Without him, how lost I would be.
For the sake of our visitors, we are studying what we're calling the chronological study of the earthly life of Jesus. And what that means is we're going through, best we can tell, in the chronology of point A to point B to point C and all the way through. That's kind of difficult to do with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John giving such sometimes different orders in the narratives that they share and where they put this event and that event. But we're trying to do our best, and we've made the disclaimer that may not always have it exactly right in the order. But because of the fact it's chronological, we're not spending as much time talking about what Jesus said and why he did things. We end up talking about that plenty, but that's not quite the focus. It's more of a let's order ourselves and where Jesus went and what he did while he was there. So that's the focus of our study this morning. And last week, just to kind of give us an idea of where we were, Jesus is in his Galilean ministry. He started the second tour of his Galilean ministry. And last week, he's questioned about fasting by the Pharisees and by the disciples of John. Why don't your disciples fast like we do, like the Pharisees do? And we discussed the nature of that interchange. Then Jesus is criticized for picking grain on the Sabbath, and Jesus answers his critics with the masterful teaching that he always was capable of, and was able to show them the fallacy of their particular viewpoint. Then he heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath in the synagogue. We discussed, if we didn't, we would like to know, was that man just there and Jesus healed him? Or we even suggested being somewhat conspiratorial. Maybe he was a plant just for the opportunity to trip Jesus up in his what he was going to do, because they knew that he had already healed on the Sabbath. The Pharisees and Sadducees didn't like that because that, in their mind, was not acceptable to do. And so whatever the case was, Jesus said, I'll heal him. He didn't worry about the criticism or the challenge that went with that. Today he continues this healing at the Sea of Galilee in Matthew chapter 12 and Mark chapter 3. In Matthew's account, but when Jesus knew it, he withdrew from there. And what did he know? Well, after he healed the man with the withered hand, Pharisees went out to figure out, basically, to put it in a common vernacular, how do we get him? How do we stop him? How do we end all of this? But when Jesus knew it, he withdrew from there, and great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. Yet he warned them not to make him known, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoking flax he will not quench, till he sends forth justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will trust. And of course that's a quote from Isaiah chapter 42 and verses 1 through 4. And Mark's account, we won't read that through because it basically says the same thing that Matthew's account does. But interestingly enough, as we back up to Matthew's account, and why were they following him? The main reason? He was healing. He was healing everybody. So that was kind of the draw. And we've talked about already how Jesus has made the statement that you're just really following me for the healing. You're not really following me for what it is I have to say or what I want you to do. And that was, okay, that's understandable because Jesus has got a timeline that he's working through in order to get his sacrificial work done. And he warned them in verse 16, which I think is a part of that discussion. And it's interesting. I almost think it's somewhat funny. Don't take that in the wrong way. But it says there's a whole multitude of people following him, and he tells that whole multitude, don't tell anybody. And again, there's a timeline that's going on there. Jesus getting from where he is now to the cross. And that was, again, how all that worked out, how Jesus made that happen. We can kind of see that through Scripture. But basically, he said, don't make this known. And then he quotes Isaiah, or at least Matthew quotes Isaiah. Jesus quotes Isaiah, and Matthew tells us about that. And notice what he says. I'm well pleased in him. I'm going to put my spirit upon him. And he will declare justice to the Gentiles. So Jesus is gradually introducing more and more of what his plan is. And so far, has Jesus left the country of Israel? Nope. He's not gone anywhere. Once he got back from Egypt as a baby, he's been in that land since then. And he will be in that land until he leaves this earth. But he's bringing up the point that something's different. Remember, we talked about the wineskins last week, and the old and the new. And you don't sew new patches on an old wineskin or an old garment because that just doesn't work. And so changes are coming, and so Jesus is seemingly gradually introducing those new ideas. And the fact that he says he will declare justice to the Gentiles. And last verse there, in his name the Gentiles will trust. And then there's that interesting statement there in verse 19. He's not going to quarrel. He's not going to cry out. Nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. And thinking about that, there's, I think, another meaning to that than just what it sounds like. Because did Jesus, was his voice heard in the streets? Well, yes. So what do you think it's saying there when the idea of his voice being heard, and nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets? What do you think that's saying in that particular context? Steve?
They weren't willing to listen.
Okay. Some weren't willing to listen, Steve says. He just said, don't tell anybody. And it just says he's not gonna quarrel, he's not gonna cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. Go ahead, Mike.
Does that have a reference, all of that together there, to his crucifixion and death?
I think in a...
He did not cry out, etc.
Yeah, I think Mike points out that does this have a reference to the crucifixion? Because wasn't Isaiah's words, he's going to go to the slaughter like a lamb, silent? So I think that's part of it as well. Go ahead, Dave.
I think, really what Mike said, he talked about being a bruised reed and a smoking flax. In other words, Jesus is not there. His big splash is not at this time. His big splash is the resurrection.
Dave said his big splash is the resurrection, and he's not there yet. This idea of a broken reed. What do you do when a plant gets broken? What do you do? It won't stand up. You see, what do? You snap it off, don't you? So the rest of the plant can grow. A smoking flax, think candle wick. It's smoking. What do you do when it's smoking? You lick your fingers and put it out, don't you? But the point that is being made here is Jesus is not going to do that. He's not going to quarrel. He's not going to cry out. He's not here at this time to fix everything. And so he's not going to be standing on the street corner railing against all of these things, trying to do his work of victory, because it says there in the last part of that quote from Isaiah, till he sends forth justice to victory. And that's not going to be able to happen until he's died on the cross. So all of this is preparatory work for that. And for him to say, don't tell anybody, is maybe as much for us as for them, in that Jesus could have ridden into Jerusalem the very first day of his ministry and established himself as king. Do you agree with that? I mean, just by his own power, could he have done that? They tried to. He could have. But that's not what Jesus was about. That's not how it had to happen. That wasn't part of God's plan. And so all of this is leading up to that. And so again, when it says he's not responding, he's not just ripping into them all the time, is because it's not that time. And we have a hard time understanding that because we don't know how all that works. But we have to understand that Jesus has a purpose, single purpose in mind. And he is working toward that purpose. Mike, you have a comment.
I'm wondering if, and Jesus asking them not to tell anybody, if that was his means of crowd control. The crowds were growing, and the more they grew, the more pressure there would have been to set up an earthly kingdom. And so he said, don't tell anyone, and then he uses Isaiah to kind of back that up, and Isaiah is pointing out that, he's not going to be one that's going to be crying out from his campaign stump and going out there and destroying the reeds or putting out the fire, fighting in this physical way. That's not his goal, which is what you're saying. And so I'm wondering if he asked them, and it's always been confusing why he said don't tell no one, especially to a crowd. And I think that he knew that if left alone, his popularity would have grown so much that it would have been the people, even without him, may have tried to take over the government of the Romans.
Mike suggests that, if you couldn't hear him, that maybe part of this is that he was trying to, using Mike's term, crowd control. Again, all these crowds are following him. If that had continued to grow and to exponentially increase, how much harder would it have been for the issues with the cross? If you've got half the population following him and wanting him to be a part of their life, they might have not allowed that. And so perhaps that's part of the reason he's doing just a little bit of crowd control now to ease people into faith, while at the same time not derailing his work that he had to do. Jesus wasn't running for office. And I hear his voice on the streets. That's kind of what, Jesus wasn't running for office. He was preaching and teaching things so that people would believe, with the idea that he still had to go to the cross before that could be fully realized. Dylan?
Yes, and we go back to the conversation about eat my flesh and drink my blood. What happened to all the disciples?
Yeah, he started teaching hard teachings, and what is that, Luke chapter 6 or 16, I can't remember off the top of my head. They quit following him, which sounded bad, but at the same time was part of this process to get to where he needed to go. All right, other thoughts or comments? Diana?
I was just thinking maybe he was wanting them to follow them, but I guess their concept was to be healed. But his concept was for them to have the spiritual understanding for what he was getting ready to do, which was sacrifice himself. So even though sometimes we go into a situation thinking we're going for one reason, God has something else in mind.
Diana suggests that part of this is, again, so that they would quit following him just for the healing and start keying in perhaps on why he's there and what he's about to do. And that was kind of a delicate balance, wasn't it? Because let's face it, if he's healing a lot of people, what are you going to focus on? You're going to focus on that healing, because that's pretty amazing stuff. And so there was a delicate balance there. I saw another hand back here. Bill?
Well, if you think about it, Roman rule was deeply unpopular. Jesus was not Roman, he was Jewish. And he fed the people, and he healed the people. The Romans did neither. They taxed and oppressed the people. So you can see there's a popular movement to say, if we can get rid of them and get Jesus in, this is going to be a path back to restoring Israel as it was in the time of David.
Bill makes the excellent point that we've got to keep the Roman authorities, and nobody liked the Romans. They were not good for Israel. They were there for a purpose, so in that way they were good for Israel, but they weren't good to Israel. And if you've got somebody who's coming in and providing the things that Rome is not, he's naturally going to be elevated, and they're going to want to make him king. And keep in mind, what was the Jewish mindset about what their Messiah would look like? That what would he do? He's going to run those Romans off. That was what they were looking for, and so Jesus is stepping into that role, again, able to do that if he wanted to, but that wasn't his purpose. And that's where all this discussion comes in that we, again, like Mike says, I have a hard time with it too about why he didn't tell them that. It just doesn't make sense. But in some ways it does make sense, because Jesus had to get to the cross. Because if he didn't go to the cross, none of this would matter. Jim?
And then on top of that, it instills that the Gentiles are going to be saved also.
Yes, and that point in there that probably was missed by a lot of people, that the Gentiles are going to be involved in this. He put that out there, so it was there. Again, what the Jews' response to that was, I don't know. My thought is they probably thought, why? We're God's people. Why are we talking about Gentiles? But that was part of it as well. Mike?
Okay, so part there that was talking about the Gentiles was the quote from Isaiah.
Right.
Centuries before, Isaiah said these things. And as I read that, I think about what we was talking about, which is, I don't know whether it's this class or Wednesday night, but the prophets wanted to understand what they were saying, and I have a feeling this is one of those prophets and one of those times when Isaiah wrote this, he probably said, looked at that and wondered about the Gentiles too. So, the people at this point, they were familiar with Isaiah. I mean, that was one of their main prophets, I think, that they focused on. So they knew this passage, and so when Jesus quoted it, they already knew it, and they probably all of their life just kind of flaked off that Gentile business.
Mike points out that this was obviously the quote from Isaiah, 700 years before Christ at least, when he was prophesying, and likely when they got to that point about the Gentiles, it's one of those passages that's kind of skipped over. We don't need to worry about that. That's not going to ever happen, because they weren't cognizant of what that would ultimately mean. So he's healing. He's healed. Last week we talked about his healing. He's healed now. And then we get to the order, and we talked about this because Jesus has already had interaction with those that would become his apostles. And on numerous occasions with them. This is the first time in the chronology that we've been going through where they're all named, where they're all identified for us. And Matthew's account, and when he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them power over unclean spirits to cast them out, to heal all kinds of sickness, all kinds of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter, Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. A couple of things about that's interesting. He called his 12 disciples to him. He called his 12 disciples to him. What does that maybe suggest to you? Did he have more than 12 at that point? But when it says he called his 12 to him, what does that make your mind think? Pardon that?
Designated.
They're designated. They're special. They are already a part of that inner circle that's around him. So he called them to him, and then he commissions them, if you will, with power over unclean spirits, to cast them out, to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of diseases. And Matthew identifies who all of those are. That VBS song comes to mind. Jesus called them one by one, Peter. We won't sing it this morning, but that always pops into my mind when I read this. Mark's account, and when he went up on a mountain and called to him those he himself wanted. That's Mark's wording, so that Mark gives us a little more clarity. These are the ones he had already selected. These are the ones he had pointed out. And do you have a comment, John?
A little bit, just on that. I thought you were going down the road of he called his 12 disciples. He didn't call 12 of his disciples. There were 12. He called them.
Yeah, John says he didn't call 12 of his disciples. He called 12 disciples. He had them picked out. He knew who they were. Then he appointed the 12, Mark's wording, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have power and heal sicknesses. And then he gives that same list as given in Matthew. Then Luke, now it came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. So Luke's account is slightly different. But notice that Luke tells us that before he did this, what did he spend all night doing? Praying. Wonder what he was praying about. Well, I can't help but think he's praying about this choice he's about to make, these people he's about to choose. Not that he didn't know who it was already, but he's praying about that. He calls his disciples. He chose 12, whom he also named apostles, and he gives that same listing there of all of those individuals who would be the tip of the spear, so to speak, for the church and its growth throughout the rest of their lives. And we know that if church, and by church I mean larger Christian view of church, tradition is correct, all but one of them died how? Martyr's death. We talked about earlier in Peter's, one of his first encounters with Jesus, Jesus told Peter how he was going to die. And so this was a lifelong commitment for them. Some of them didn't live very long, but it was a commitment that would take them literally the rest of their life. John being the only one who, as far as we know, died of old age. But they all became that group. Jeannie?
What's the difference between an apostle and a disciple?
Okay, what's the difference between an apostle and a disciple? Dave?
Well, there's the apostolic authority that we see from the writing of Paul and Peter, James, and John, and it's often cited in their writing. The disciples didn't have that authority. We're disciples, we are not apostles. Jesus had lots more followers than just these 12, but the 12 were everyone's being prepared for the establishment of the church.
Okay, so Dave suggests that the 12 were elevated in a sense for their role that they were going to have in establishing the church. Sandy, you had a comment.
There's one scripture that says to be called an apostle, you had to have started from the beginning.
Yes, when Judas hung himself and they had to replace him with Matthias, that was one of the qualifications. You had to be there from the beginning. So the difference between... Go ahead, Janelle. No, go ahead. I've already forgot what I was going to say.
Jesus chose the 12 because he had them. They were the ones that were going to establish the church. Disciples are more believers, and yes, they're teaching and they're living the way Jesus wanted them to live. But the apostles were the ones that took the word everywhere and established the church.
Janelle again talks about it. Dave mentioned the idea of the establishment of the church. These are the guys who are going to be the leaders in doing that. Are apostles disciples? Yes. There's a larger group there. Are disciples apostles? 12 of them were, but not all of them. So there was a designation there between disciples and apostles and who they were going to be. Apostles, again, he gave them power that maybe wasn't given to other people. They could pass on that power to other people, whereas others couldn't. So there is a designation to show that these gentlemen were distinct from the rest of the group in their abilities by the power given them and their authority that they would wield after Jesus left the earth. Mike, you had a comment.
If you look at the definition of the two words, just the definition, it would kind of bring out that same point. A disciple was a learner, someone that was following and learning. An apostle was one that had gotten graduated from that learning basically and given a position of authority and was sent out, one who was sent out as a spokesperson for the one they were apostles from.
Yeah, Mike points out the difference between the wording of apostolos, which is the Greek word for apostle, and the word disciple that is more of a learner versus somebody who's sent. Somebody who's, shall we say, commissioned. We get a lot of military people here, so you know what that word means. The idea of commissioned to do something. So that's what separates them apart. Got the answer, Jeannie?
Yeah. One more.
One more.
So over time, there are only 14 apostles, the replacement for Judas and then Paul?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think in one point Barnabas called an apostle. Am I reading that wrong?
Yeah, he was called apostle, but I think that was more in terms of the messenger than he was.
Yeah. But so whether he was an official apostle or we just call it apostle, that will not work. But I think the point Jeannie's making is you've got apostles who served in that capacity all their life, and then how many were there after that? No more. Because they fulfilled a specific special role within the church for its establishment, for its growth, and not something that continued on because once the word was available, didn't need that group of people who were inspired. Jesus said, I'm going to send you my helper, and my helper is going to guide you into all things that I've ever said. But once the word had been written, there was no more need for that, so therefore we don't have apostles anymore. John?
Just skip reading Acts, word apostle and apostles used repeatedly and not the same.
Right. It's used, apostles specifically used because Luke is writing here, and Luke's going to use that term, so there was obviously a designation there that was familiar to the people of that time, setting apart their differing roles. And I guess that's about all we can say about that. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on? Janelle?
Well, we just read that Jesus did give them the ability to heal people, and the disciples, the leaders, did not have that ability. But that was, centered on those men that were out and had that information.
Yeah, Janelle points out that they were given powers to heal people that the rest of the disciples weren't given. Obviously, Pentecost is going to make that different as far as what disciples received with the falling of the Holy Spirit. And even with the apostles, wasn't there a time when they tried to cast out a demon and couldn't do it? So it wasn't a complete. Jesus didn't elevate them to junior Jesuses. He gave them power they needed to do their mission, which was to preach the gospel, and that's what they did. All right. Anything else? All right. We now move to what, and this is not a biblical name. It's what it's called today, the Mount of Beatitudes. Just from that, what are Beatitudes? Blessings. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they who mourn. So what does this have to do with what event are we about to get to? Sermon on the Mount. All right, so that's where we're headed. So there's a map there of Capernaum, which is right there along the shore of Galilee. Mount of Beatitudes. If you're standing looking at it to see Capernaum, it's right up there. And so that's where we're headed next, in the Mount of Beatitudes. He preaches the Sermon on the Mount. We've got 2 accounts of that. Matthew 5, all the way through chapter 7, and Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 49. At the top of what, and again, keep in mind, we did not get GPS coordinates from the Bible for where this event happened. So this is the place where a preponderance of scholars and historians suggest that this might have happened. And that's why we use that spot. So we don't know if Jesus actually stood there and preached a Sermon on the Mount here. But as always in the land of Israel, if anything important happened there, they build a church on top of it. And this particular building is on the top of that mountain. It's a beautiful setting. From there you can look out, you can see Capernaum, you can see down around the coast of the Sea of Galilee all the way around to Tiberias, and the end you can see the far end of the Sea of Galilee, the Golan Heights. It's a beautiful place, and the building itself is spectacular, and the grounds are kept very well. Here's an aerial view of that particular structure. This is looking toward the southwest from wherever this camera shot was. I'm assuming it's a drone shot. Looking to the southwest. It's called the Church of the Beatitudes. It's a Roman Catholic church. It was dedicated back in 1938. It's octagonal in shape, one side for each of the Beatitudes. And it was designed by a guy by the name of Antonio Barluzzi. He was an Italian architect and a prolific architect because he's credited with the design or the restoration of some 24 structures in the land of Israel during his lifetime. So this is the spot where we think Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. Major differences between Matthew and Luke. Obvious difference is Matthew's is much longer than Luke's. Luke doesn't go into all the details. Matthew's narrative is much longer than Luke's. Matthew's has 2,410 words and 109 verses. That's out of the New King James Version. Luke only has 757 words and 29 verses. So Luke's is an abbreviated version of that. And the discussion comes up, we're not going to spend but a couple of seconds on it, is why it was different. And I'm going to tell you why I think it's different is because Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience, and there's a lot more in there for the Jewish people than would be relevant per se to Gentiles. And so Luke hits the salient points that his readers would resonate with, whereas Matthew's is more of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute because there's some wording there. These are the things, the subheadings, if you will, of the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. He talks about salt and light, Jesus fulfilling the law, murder, adultery, marriage, divorce, oaths, the second mile, love your enemy, charitable deeds, prayer, fasting, treasures in heaven. You can look at that list there. Those are all the things that Matthew relates about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Luke's, there's the Beatitudes. They share that in common. Jesus pronounces woes. Matthew doesn't include that. Love your enemy, do not judge. A tree is known by its fruit, built on the rock. And I know you probably can't read all of that, but there's kind of a comparison between the two. All the green words are Matthew's account, and I put in the appropriate place, as close as I can get, Obviously, what Luke includes, the Beatitudes, makes sense where they are. Jesus pronounced woes in there somewhere. Love your enemy, same thing Matthew talked about. Do not judge. And again, that was actually a slot off of where it ought to be in the list there. A tree is known by its fruit, which is talking about the true and false teaching. And then the parable of the two builders and the building on the rock are the same. So there's a comparison of the events of the Sermon on the Mount that were recorded in Matthew and in Luke. Something to note in Matthew's narrative, and this is why I said earlier, I think that there was a Jewish component to Matthew's narration versus Luke's narration, because in that Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, and it gives you the references there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, what's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. You have heard that it was said. So he's speaking to Jews, and he's saying, you have heard that it was said. Who have you heard that it was said from? The rabbis, the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious teachers. You have heard that it was said. And the question is, why did Matthew say, you have heard that it was said? Because in chapter 5 and verse 20, he's going to say, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that it was said. That's wrong. I say to you, this is how you ought to interpret that. Chapter 5 and verse 48, he says, be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And I think the key understanding to what we're talking about here is actions are a product of the heart. And the sole issue of everything Jesus was teaching had to do with the heart. And so Matthew's account was as much counteracting the things that they've been taught that were not right. In fact, what they had taught didn't go far enough. Because it said, don't commit adultery. Okay, we get that. Well, Jesus would say what? Don't look on a woman to lust after her. You've already committed adultery in her heart. Jesus makes it harder than what the scribes and Pharisees did. And he's saying there, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not going to get into the kingdom. It's not easy getting into the kingdom. And you can almost hear the thoughts in the heads of the people who, in their mind, were the most religious, most spiritual people on the face of the planet? Scribes and Pharisees. And you got to be better than them. And their thought might be, that can't happen. There's no way. But by Jesus pointing out the fallacies of their teaching, he's able to tell, it's not about you're going to have to be more righteous. You just have to be righteous in the right way. And it's all got to come from the heart, not from your rule book that you've been living under with the scribes and Pharisees. All right, we're out of time, obviously, so we'll quit right there and pick up with the rest of the idea of the Sermon on the Mount next week. Thank you.